Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome Doug Lewin. He is the president of Stoic Energy. It is an Austin-based consulting firm. Doug, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Robert. Good to be with you.
Now, I warned you, I don't warn some guests, but guests introduce themselves on this podcast. So imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, and you have 60 seconds or so to introduce yourself. Please tell us who you are.
So I'm Doug Lewin. I've been working on energy issues in Texas for just about 20 years. Was a staffer at the legislature a long time ago. I've worked a long part of my career on energy efficiency. These days do a bunch of different things, but I think the things most relevant to this are writing the Texas Energy and Power newsletter on Substack, hosting the Texas Power podcast with Renewable Energy World. Yeah, we'll leave it there. I'll tell you, Robert. A couple years ago, people would kind of yawn when I talked about what I did, but after February 2021, everybody got much more interested, and it became much more popular at dinner parties and bars and that sort of thing.
Imagine that. Yeah. Well, and there's a lot going on, and that's what we want to talk about. And by the way, we'll mention it here: douglewin.substack.com. You're on Substack, so am I, and trying to drive traffic to our various Substacks. Let me just set the stage here because I just looked these numbers up. And for people who don't understand or don't live in Texas or get an idea of how big the Texas electricity business is. Now, I'll preface this by saying I'm from Oklahoma. I'm not here to brag about Texas, but the Texas electric market is the biggest in the U.S. Total electric sales in the United States in 2022 were $488 billion. The 4,200 terawatt hours. Texas accounted for 46 billion in electric sales and 450 terawatt hours. So Texas alone accounts for about 10% of the entire U.S. electricity market, which is obviously a very big market. But that's one reason why the stakes are so high in all the legislation that's now pending at the Capitol, and it's coming to a close. And Doug, you've been writing a lot about it, and I'm following your work for weeks on this and been meaning to get in touch. So what's the status? There are a lot of bills that are pending now, and you've been following a lot of them. But a lot of the activity is around the performance credit mechanism and all the various things around that. And I've been looking at this for months. I still don't understand it. Tell us, give us the quickest rundown you can about all the legislation that's pending and what it will mean for consumers.
It's interesting. There was a hearing just Wednesday night, and Chairman Hunter of House State Affairs asked one of the witnesses, tell me this thing you're talking about. It was either performance credit mechanism or something like that. In 15 seconds, explain it so somebody can really understand it. I felt so bad for the guy. I'm like, there is no way to explain that in 15 seconds. This stuff is all very complicated. If I get too much into jargon, Robert, stop me and
no problem.
And ask me to explain the terms. But basically what the performance credit mechanism is, and I'll explain these terms. So there are there's a lot of different forms of electricity markets you can have. But if you sort of start at the root and then sort of branch out from there, sort of the first branch you get to, the first sort of fork in the road where you go two different ways, is one kind is called an energy only market, and one is called a capacity market. Texas has, ever since 1999 and the restructuring that happened then, had an energy only market. And Texas policymakers have fiercely protected that for reasons we can talk about, but mostly comes down to competition and sort of an economic theory, kind of a little bit of a Hayekian kind of, right? Like, markets are better at determining where resources should go and things like that. And so, whereas in a capacity market, you have much more of an administrative function where administrators are deciding, drawing demand curves and making big decisions about how much should be procured. And it's much more of sort of a statist or bureaucratic kind of an approach. And effectively, what the PUC and ERCOT are trying to do with the performance credit mechanism is leave the energy only market and establish a capacity market. Now, they've been careful to say, no, we're going to preserve the energy only market until CERAWeek in Houston about 2 months ago, when the ERCOT CEO, the new ERCOT CEO, Pablo Vegas, said the quiet part out loud and said, we need a capacity market. He said, there's three legs of the stool. We've only got two of them. The third one's capacity. We need that. And so effectively what they're trying to do is pay for capacity that will be idle a lot, but be paid even when it's not operating.
Well, that's a good primer and I think pretty succinct. So the basic bifurcation is between regulated and deregulated, right? To kind of make it's not exactly that way. We call it restructured. Ken Lay called it restructured, but in states in the Southeast, Georgia, et cetera, those are regulated markets. Texas, California, a few others have gone more toward this restructured or deregulated markets. Is that fair?
It is. I would amend that slightly and say that that's another sort of branch in the tree, and they're related because you can have restructured competitive markets that are capacity markets. So if you look at like the PJM market,
Okay.
And then there's the sort of regulated versus deregulated, or folks in the industry like to say restructured because there's still some regulation, and there the difference is, are you vertically integrated? Are you a utility that has all the functions, generation, retail, transmission, distribution under one roof? Or have you split those into different components? So there's kind of two different, or I guess 4 different branches, right? 2 different splits going into 2 different branches each. Sorry,
Sure.
I know that's confusing.
No. Well, it is all confusing, and that's one of the things about the
Yes.
electricity business. Why it's the Lobbyist Full Employment Act, right? There's all these different parts of the business. It's an incredibly large business, as I said, nearly $500 billion a year in revenue. So the stakes are enormous. But traditionally, the utility business, the electric sector, has been vertically integrated, right? From the times of Edison and Insull, the one company would own the generator, they own the wires, and they own the meter, right? But so now we've gone to this other model. But why? So this other model where you have different players and you have things like Gritty that don't own any generation, they don't own any wires, don't own any meters, and yet they were considered to be in the electricity business, which that's a longer part of the story, which we know in Texas. And then I live in Austin, you live in Austin, where we're captive to the city of Austin's utility. So we live in a state that is restructured, but we live in a segment of the state where we don't have a choice. So again, it's all complicated. But the PCM, the performance credit mechanism, as I look at what's going on in the legislature and reading your stuff, douglewin.substack.com, that this is where a lot of the activity has been around trying to provide incentives in the Texas marketplace to have dispatchable generation. Is that the simplest way to define what the objective is?
I think that's there. I think that's fair to say that's what their objective is, what their stated objective is. I think a lot of the folks that have really been pushing the hardest for the performance credit mechanism are the generators. They tend to be the only ones that are supporting it at this point, particularly incumbent generators. And I think that their objective, not necessarily the stated one, is to drive more revenue to their existing generation. They will say that they want new generation in the market, but that doesn't. Have you ever heard of any incumbent industry that goes to a legislative body and lobbies hard and spends a lot of money in order to bring new competitors into their arena? They're mostly using the performance credit mechanism to try to get more revenue for their existing generation.
So, and to be specific here, because we separated the wires companies from the generators. So we're talking about the generators now, the big ones would be NRG and Vistra, right, in Texas. Am I remembering correctly?
And throw Calpine in there too. Yes.
So the NRG, Vistra, and Calpine. And I've been getting emails, seeing ads that are talking about, saying, oh, support this. And so, let me ask the question directly. So the Texas electric market's $45 billion a year. How much is at stake? You've written about this, about how much money could be going to different generators or different, if this PCM is quasi capacity market, I'll call it that, is put into place. How much money is at stake here? And is any of this good for consumers?
It's none of this is good for consumers. Not the performance credit mechanism is certainly not good for consumers. So the number I think that 45 billion probably takes in all of the money spent on poles and wires. So that's everything. I think that in the ERCOT market, the wholesale power generation market, the number you usually hear is 25 billion or so. The consultant that the PUC hired to originally to do a study on the load serving entity obligation, which also would have been very expensive and wouldn't have actually solved our problems, and then they abandoned for the performance credit mechanism. That consultant said, though they recommended their own consultant did not recommend the performance credit mechanism. They recommended the other one, the load serving entity obligation. But they said that the PCM would cost $5.7 billion per year gross, and net would cost $460 million. So that's 5.7 billion. The reason why that number is so large is because you're paying for that capacity to be there. That's the capacity market function. Those are all those capacity payments. I think those numbers are almost certainly low, particularly the net number. And we got an inkling of this, Robert, because what the Senate really does not like the PCM. The Texas Senate was made very clear they don't like this. They passed a bill out of the Senate, passed a couple bills actually, that had a $500 million cap in it. Well, the generators,
and this is the so-called guardrails is the term that
yes.
Right.
Senate Bill 2012 is the main vehicle for that. And I think that bill will move through the House. I think that's the main sort of electric market bill that will move this session.
Right.
The House changed it to a net number and said, okay, you guys say 460 million is what the PUC consultant says, let's cap the net at 500 million. They're still crying bloody murder. They're like, you can't do that to us. It has to be higher. Well, they've been running around saying it's only $2 a month. It's only $460 million. But then when you try to put a cap on it, the truth kind of comes out that no, that's not nearly enough money. It's going to be many billions of dollars.
Well, so just to revisit, so I'm just looking at the Electric Power Monthly, which is just to give you the reference on this. So this is the total value of electricity sales to end use customers in Texas last year, $46.5 billion. Let me see, of that 23 billion was in residential, and rates went up a huge amount from between 2021 and 2022, 14 billion for commercial and about 9 billion in industrial sales. So that 46 billion is just the value of all the electricity that was sold in Texas last year. It's just a very large number, but
it is.
But the capacity mechanism and I had a meeting with Peter Lake, the chairman of the Public Utility Commission, in January, and they explained this to me then, and I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I understand it now. It's a quasi capacity market where generators would be paid to have generation available in case there was insufficient generation at times of peak demand. Is that, am I gotten the gist of it, or you're shaking your head and grimacing a little bit? Yeah.
Well, I mean, you got it mostly. I would just say the way they're describing it isn't, and look, there's a lot of details of it that are not defined. One of the reasons it's so hard to have a conversation like this, and actually, as people, I get asked this a lot, like, what is it actually? Well, we don't know. And if you look at the memo that the PUC curiously adopted on January 12th, 2 days after the legislature started, they recommended this way forward, even though the Senate had already told them they didn't like it. The timing was really kind of curious, but that memo is really like 4 pages of bullet points and questions. And so there's a lot we don't know about it. They really have not defined it, but in as much as it is understandable, they're looking at taking a certain number of hours. For some reason, 30 hours is thrown around a lot. I don't think there's any analysis that suggests that 30 is better than 40 or 20, but for some reason, everybody's talking about 30. Whether that's seasonally or annually hasn't been decided. It even could be monthly, another question that hasn't been answered. And then what is that 30 hours? Is it peak demand? Is it net peak, which would be demand minus wind and solar resources? Is it the IMM, the Independent Market Monitor, wants it to be rodal cap, which is what the real-time online reserves, like the time when the reserves are the lowest. So there's different ways to do this, and they haven't decided. But you would pick something and you'd say, this number of hours during this condition on the system, if you're running, we'll pay you. And how much will we pay you? Well, that depends on, and this is where it gets into a capacity market. What is the mandated reserve margin? What is the reliability standard you have? What is the demand curve that the administrators draw, right? So now you've got bureaucrats deciding, here's the demand curve, and we're going to pay you based on this. It becomes an administered market. It becomes a market where the generators will have people over there all the time, effectively lobbying the grid operator to draw that curve in a way that's most beneficial to them, to pay them the most amount of revenue. we'd be out of the days of having a really competitive market.
Let me.
It's convoluted. I know. I didn't clarify anything there.
Look, it's incredibly convoluted, and it's one of the functions of the way the Texas market is now. And Ed Hers has made the comment that the nodal protocols in ERCOT are 1,800 pages long, right? So, well, let me follow on that. So, because this is something I've thought about and reading what you've been writing about and all the different bills that are pending. And I'll follow up that you're right. In January, the Public Utility Commission, the commission voted to approve this PCM idea. And it wasn't, I don't think the ink was even dry. And Senator Schwertner put out a memo saying, well, we oppose this, right? I mean, it wasn't even, it happened almost instantaneously. One of the lead senators in terms of regulating the utility sector in Texas said, no, this isn't going to work. We're not in favor of this. But the question that I've been mulling for a long time is the market just simply gotten too complicated to administer properly? I mean, because this is one of the things, and I'll just a brief bit of background. When I wrote my first book, it was on Enron now more than 20 years ago. One of the first guys I interviewed is a guy named Jim Walzell, and he was a longtime gas executive, not gas executive. He quit when Ken Lay came on board. And he said, look, Bryce, I don't think that this deregulation of the electric market is going to be good for consumers. So two questions. I'll ask that question. Has been deregulation or restructuring been good for Texas consumers?
So remind me the gentleman you had on a month or so ago. I listened to the podcast you had with, was it Jim Muncie?
Jim Murchie. Yeah.
Murchie, forgive me. Jim
right.
Murchie. It was a great podcast, by the way. If your listeners haven't listened to that one yet, go back and listen to it again. I agree with him. I do think that deregulation on balance has been good for consumers. I think there is ample evidence and data to suggest that. And I just generally am a believer in competitive markets. I think when there is a commodity or a product or a service that can be offered competitively, it should be offered competitively. I understand the history of the electric utility industry. Obviously not fully. I'm trying to learn more about it like everybody else, but I love reading history books about the electric utility industry. And you mentioned Insull earlier. I've studied him and am fascinated by how the monopoly utility model came to be. And just as Murchie said on your podcast, there was a reason why it was set up that way. You guaranteed a rate of return because capital markets didn't want to put money into an electric grid. You know, at the Texas Capitol, there's electric light in the House and Senate chambers. There's also gas lines running to the light. If you look up at the lights, there's gas lines to this day running there. And the reason is because they weren't sure that this electricity thing was actually going to work out, right? So in those days, in the early days of the industry, you had to give a guaranteed rate of return because that attracted capital. And it was phenomenally successful in attracting capital. And that's why we now have ubiquitous electricity. But the question is, do you still want to send that signal, like to a utility, hey, spend as much capital as you possibly can, and we'll give you 10% on every dollar you spend? Or is there a different signal we want to send now? And I think it's a different signal. I don't think you want to get into the days of a regulated rate of return. And so, you know, capital, I think that competitive markets, and I think there's plenty of evidence to support this, have driven prices lower for consumers. Does that mean it's perfect? No. And just like Murchie said, you know, I think quoted Churchill, right? It's like, it's the worst system except for all the others. And if you look at what, you know, they have in Alabama or, you know, anywhere, you know, Southern and Duke are operating. I mean, these are fiefdoms, right? Where they effectively, Alabama is a great example where they get whatever they want out of their regulators. They get ridiculous rates of return. And that's a fleecing of consumers. I'm just a fan of competitive markets.
Well, let me follow up on one point you made there, because this is something I've also thought quite a lot about. And I heard the idea from a long time ago now from a guy named Mark Gabriel, who used to run the Western Area Power Administration. And this was 15 years ago. He said, you know, we're misapprehending the electricity business. He said, we're selling it like a commodity, but it's really a service. And that idea kind of percolated for a little while until I went to Lebanon and saw that the generator mafia, they don't put meters on their customers. They sell amps. They don't care how much energy they're using. They're more concerned about power, right? They're selling it as a service, not a commodity. So is electricity a commodity or is it a service?
What a great question. It's both, right? And I think with each passing year, it will become more and more of a service and less of a commodity. Let's take it.
And why is that?
The reason for that is that I think, there's the great quote that goes back, 30 or 40 years or whatever from Amory Lovins, the founder of Rocky Mountain Institute, who says, people don't care at all about a kilowatt hour. They want hot showers and cold beer, right? That's right. I mean, in February, people would have paid a whole lot of money for a hot shower, right?
Sure.
I mean, it was in February 2021 in Texas, right? So it's really what you care about is what you get from the power. Nobody actually cares about, start talking to somebody about how it actually gets generated and a turbine spins and it goes over the wires and they're like, I don't fucking care. I want to watch. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't cuss. You can bleep that out later.
It's a podcast. We can say what we like.
They just want to watch their show and go to the fridge and know their beer's cold. And so I think actually offering it as a service. Let me give an example of how I think the market is changing. I think there's a company based out of Houston called Enchanted Rock. Enchanted Rock sells effectively little microgrids to, not so little, megawatt scale, but to a lot of customers. Two of their most prominent customers are HEB and Buc-ee's. They buy these systems because HEB just got tired of CenterPoint, a monopoly utility to this day, right? Even with restructuring and deregulation, we have monopolies in the state of Texas. Those are the poles and wires companies. CenterPoint was so unreliable for them that they were having to throw out, dumpsters full of food on a regular basis because the power would go out. And they decided that they would go ahead and purchase these small gas generators that would run on site. They also do a ton of, not Enchanted Rock, but HEB does a lot of solar and storage as well. And I think this is like the mix of the future, right? It's going to be small gas that for when you need it, solar and storage for most of the time. And what they ended up with then was a system that basically had complete uptime. They didn't lose power at their stores and that had Enchanted Rock systems during Uri. They did in Austin because Austin wouldn't allow them to have Enchanted Rock systems here because it's their territory. They got a law and changed that, and now I think they're able to have the systems here. But that is selling energy as a service. That is a company that said, I will pay a premium because I don't want to throw food out and I want to be able to serve my community when there's a hurricane or there's a ice storm or whatever it might be. It is critical that we have power all the time. So they're buying it as a service. I think, this is one of the things I love about a competitive market, right? You mentioned Gritty earlier. Gritty is an example of bad example of a competitive, offering that didn't serve customers well. But I think within the competitive market, you're going to see, and you're already seeing this in upstarts like Octopus and Ohm Connect and David Energy and even Tesla offering customers that's where you're getting is that energy as a service. You're starting to get to that point where none of these companies are quite doing this yet, but I think this is where it's going. I think, Robert, before too long, we'll be at a point where a company can say to an electric customer, any homeowner, if you let me see your bills for the last couple of years, I think I can offer you a product that is 10% lower than that. And you're just going to pay me that 10% less. I'll put solar panels on your roof. I'll put a fancy, EV level 2 charger in your garage, power, a battery on the wall. And a smart thermostat in, and we're going to put little sensors on your pool pump and on your hot water heater. And I'm going to be able to control these things. You're going to tell me I never want the temperature below this or above that. And if that band is wider, then your price goes down. If that band is narrower, your price goes up a little bit. Within that band, I can move it. And their profit will be how much they can keep that cost down, right? So if the person was paying $2,000 a year and they say now your bill is $1,800, and that provider as a service is able to then modulate the use inside the home and bring that down to like $1,400, they're clearing a profit of $400, the homeowner's saving $200. And you're not telling the homeowner you need to do anything. It's all automated. You don't have to worry about changing your behavior, anything like that. I think that's the direction we're going.
So as you're saying that, Doug, what I'm hearing is that the generation is moving closer to the customer.
I think, that's distributed energy resources. There was literally a report out from Brattle Group, one of the most prominent energy consulting groups in America, that said that if we have what are called, these are often being referred to now as virtual power plants. So if you take the example I just gave, and you add that, take thousands of homes that have solar and storage and the smart charger for their vehicle and the pool pumps and all that stuff hooked up to sensors. Now you have those thousands of sources that each can get a kilowatt or 2 kilowatts, and you times that by 1,000. Now you're into the megawatt range, right? And you times that by millions, and you're into the gigawatt range. And so, yes, I think that is siting the power closer to where it's used, making the usage itself smart and connected. That sort of a system, distributed, decentralized, digitized, all of that stuff, I think it's actually closer than we realize.
And so is that going to be good for the consumer?
I think so. What the Brattle report showed was that if we did that, I think the number they got was like, I've only read the article about it, I haven't read the report yet, but it's like, I think they said something like if we got 60 gigawatts worth of those virtual power plants, it could save on the order of $20 to $30 billion for consumers. It's a lot cheaper to do that than it is to build big central station power plants, which is the Sam Insel model, right?
Right.
Fundamentally, what we're talking about right now is a move away from the Sam Insel model to something very new.
And that was always toward the bigger power plants because of the enthalpic efficiency of having a bigger power plant. They were more thermally efficient. And therefore, because of that, then it made sense to make them big and run them 24/7, sell as many kilowatt hours as you could. And that was how Insel drove down the price of electricity, right, over time. But now, because of solar and storage, that's changed. So let's talk about storage for a minute. Now, I've followed the battery business for a long time. There are a lot of battery companies. There's a lot of battery capacity looking to get into the Texas market. Do you know how much battery capacity is pending? You're pulling out a paper there, like this number right off the top of your head. How much is it? What are we looking at?
No, I'm pulling out the paper because I want to make a note and not forget to say something about Insel later. So, okay. But no, on storage, right now, Robert, we've got I think we're just a little over 3,000 megawatts, might be like 3,200 or 3,300 megawatts. To put that on, to put some scale to that, Austin Energy's peak load is roughly 3,500, 4,000 megawatts. We've got about an Austin worth of storage. That's a phenomenal. I mean, that's a 10x increase in less than 2 years. ERCOT expects that by summer of 2024, obviously not this summer, but next summer, that will be at about 10,000 megawatts. So it'll be another 3x by then. There's a lot more in the queue. Hard to say much beyond that, right? Because so much of it just depends on what happens in the intervening time period. But yeah, storage we've got a lot of it, and it is a lot more of it is coming in a big way.
So 10,000 by 2024 in the state, and I'm remembering just off the top of my head. So the U.S. has about 1.2 terawatts of capacity. Texas would be about 10% of that. So we have about 110,000 megawatts of capacity, generation capacity in Texas. Isn't that right? Something like that.
You're right in the ballpark. I don't know exactly what the number of the capacities, but it's something. We actually have more than that, but a lot of that is wind and solar. So you're never going to get 100% capacity out of wind or 100% capacity out of solar. So like you derate that. 110 is about right. Our peak usage is 80,000 megawatts or 80 gigawatts. That was July of last year.
Right. And that's, and therein is the key, right? And being able to size the grid for those peak times, right? Because the peaks generally don't last very long, but you have to have that ability to meet that demand 24/7, 365, right? So will the batteries help in the winter peaking? Because that's one of the things that we're seeing. And that was one of the issues around Winter Storm Uri, what we saw in February, where wind and solar went to Cancun with Ted Cruz again. Will batteries be able to step in when it gets cold and when it gets super hot? Will that be able to do that peak shaving? Isn't that the term that Was that where they would be deployed?
So I think so. There's there's really two things. I really think winter and summer have to be treated as very different problem sets, and we ought to address them as such. And to be clear, right? So renewables in February, yes, they were quite low then. I will say in December, the December 22nd, December 23rd one, without renewables, had we been thermal only, you saw what happened at TVA, right? TVA had outages. TVA has about 2% renewables. They're 98% thermal system. They had outages. Why? Because a lot of their thermal plants broke, right? Equipment breaks in extreme cold and extreme heat. Gas and coal in Texas have had big problems. So to be clear, all resources struggle when we're in these extremes, and we've got to figure out how to deal with that. Let's talk about summer first, because I actually think summer is easier, not easy. It's a challenge, no doubt about it. I think winter is the much more wicked problem, but summer, that's what you said earlier is exactly right. Right, it's very short time periods, right, where you're going to have scarcity, and it, particularly with all the solar we're getting. So we're over 15 gigawatts right now. We are trending towards at least 20 to 24 probably by next summer. In fact, I think we'll be closer to 20 than 15 probably even this summer, getting closer to like 24, 25 by next summer, and potentially going much higher than that. It's going to depend on a lot of things, including what the legislature and the PUC and ERCOT do. And we could talk more about that. But that solar resource is phenomenal for the summertime, right? We are very used to having very hot summers, very high demand, not just on like July 13th last year, but just throughout the summer, right? Consistently days over 70,000 megawatts. Right. And that's pricey. That's expensive for consumers. Solar is going to knock those prices down. We're going to see that some this summer. I think we'll see it even more next summer. Solar is phenomenally coincident with those peaks at 3 or 4 in the afternoon on hot days when there's not a cloud in the sky, as most Texas summer days are. But does create a ramping problem, right? As we all know, this will be news to none of your listeners, the sun does go down. The nice thing about that is, the sun's going down, precisely when the sun is going down. This is a mystery to exactly no one, so you can plan for it. Right. And then you do have this ramp where the sun goes down. Demand is down too, but not nearly as much as the solar production. So then you got to figure out how to fill that 1 or 2 or maybe on some days 3 or 4 hour gap. Storage is beautiful for that. The other thing that's beautiful for that is demand response, demand flexibility. So what we were just talking about with distributed energy resources. Folks have, battery storage in their garage, whether on the wall or in their car. It could be deployed during those times. Smart thermostats, you just make the house colder at 3 or 4. This will be terrible for Texans. Hey, we're going to make you colder in your house in July in Texas, and you might actually get paid for it, right? So you pre-cool your home, then you don't have to use your AC during that 8 or 9 o'clock period at night that Chairman Lake was talking about during the press conference just the other day. So all of the key to the summer, Robert, is flexibility, right? It's that operational flexibility. Reciprocating gas engines, right? Like LCRA made an announcement a while back. They were going to build some gas plants. They're all like 19 megawatts. They're very small. These are just meant to fire up for a few hours and then shut them down, right? The flexibility is really going to be the code word for the summer.
Well, let's follow up on that. And then I want to go back to the winter problem because, I recorded a podcast. So we haven't aired it yet with a guy from Wartsilla. What is his last name? Musin is his last name. But we talked about that LCRA deal. 190 megawatts, I think it is, 10 of these big 50 SG massive reciprocating gas-fired engines, right? They could fire up and shut down in a matter of minutes, use no water, and can be deployed in a whole lot of places, right? So that to me is a really interesting technology, even compared to gas turbines. But what occurs to me too, so just back to Enchanted Rock, are those on-site gas turbines that they're deploying? Are those recip engines that they're deploying? You said for Buc-ee's and for HEB.
I believe that they are gas because I know that that is one of the things they talk about is like, the gas plants that were shut down during Uri. They talk about how because they're on the distribution system, they're behind the city gate, as it's called, right?
Yeah,
Then
right.
they are not shut off. They have very reliable access to gas during these storms. So they may have different things they offer their customers. I don't know what their whole portfolio is, but I think most of them are gas.
Right, but you didn't. I'm just curious whether they were turbine engines or reciprocating engines, or maybe it's beyond what your familiarity with is. That's okay. I'm just to me, I just find it very interesting that there's such an old technology. The Otto cycle engine is very durable, right? And the service cycles are very well known, and these engines are incredibly durable, and that they're now being deployed in a whole different way that it was pretty unexpected, I think.
And the key to them is that they're low capacity factor, right? You don't, the point is, and look, you mentioned how high power prices were during 2022. Why were power prices so high during 2022? Because Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, and because gas went to $7, $8, $9. And as many renewables as we have, we're still a gas dominated system. The majority of the capacity on our system is gas. The majority of the generation on our system is gas. And so we're highly dependent on it. And when the price of gas goes high, so does the price of electric bills. When you have wind and solar, then you have a zero marginal fuel cost. You still are going to need gas, but the lower capacity factor it is, the better. This is why I think that it's so sort of problematic that we're moving to, or maybe moving, hopefully not moving to the PCM. We'll see the way that all that goes. Is the market that we have set up right now is incredibly rich for those kinds of generators, right? So like there's all this thing of like, well, don't pay wind and solar. They're already getting federal subsidies. They're not producing on peak. We have a system that richly incentivizes these flexible resources like reciprocating engines, like storage, like demand response. If we need some market changes to allow demand in to compete, and we can talk about that. But those flexible resources are richly compensated in the market right now. And if we move away from that, you're actually sending a signal that you want more of what Insull was building. You want more of like, well, he may have been building reciprocating engines, but like where the industry went in the 50s and 60s and 70s with great big 600-800 megawatt coal plants and things like that. It's trying to drag the market back into a different era than letting it evolve and really richly compensate resources that are fast acting, low capacity factor.
And the reason they would be compensated is because they can then jump into the market when prices are high.
That's right. That's exactly it.
So, and it's interesting that you mentioned, and LCRA, Lower Colorado River Authority, for people who are not familiar with Texas, this is it's a governmental entity based here in Austin. It operates the hydroelectric dams along the Colorado River and has owns a coal plant, owns gas plants, and is a big player in the power markets here in Texas, and has been apparently pretty successful in lobbying in the legislature and had some possibility of even being some favorable legislation to them. But I want to just repeat too, because that's one of the other parts of this, that Texas has a lot of cooperatives. It has investor-owned utilities. It has municipally owned utilities. It has these retail electric providers. It's a very complicated market, right? So that's one of the other things that's so interesting about what's happening at the legislature. And the last day of the legislature is May 29th, I believe your piece today pointed out. So the stakes are just enormous in terms of the billions of dollars that are now potentially won or lost, depending on who gets favorable legislation passed that will help them socialize the costs and privatize the profits, the American way, right? This is how it works. Well, let me ask this. Written this about this question here. Texas, there's a lot of growth in renewables here. The CREZ lines were built, the high voltage transmission capacity was built here. Do we need a lot more transmission capacity built to accommodate more renewables in Texas?
Well, and this was another thing in that great podcast you did with Mr. Murchie. No, forgive me. That was the one with Sheffield. I've been listening to some of your podcasts. I like them very much, Robert. The one with Scott Sheffield from Pioneer, right. And he talked about the electrification of the Permian Basin, right? That they're trying to get So for those that didn't listen, I'll back up a step, but y'all should listen to that podcast too. So you gave me a couple plugs. Now I've given you now I'm
Sure.
plugging your podcast on your podcast. The growth of oil and gas in the Permian has been, just astounding, unbelievable. I don't even know what adjective, right? I mean, it's beyond what anybody could have imagined before, shale and hydraulic fracturing and all of that. So what is happening now in the Permian Basin, though, is that a lot of the producers, including Pioneer, who you had Scott Sheffield, the CEO of that company, the largest producer in the Permian in Texas. And he's saying that he and many of the other producers want to be grid connected, right? If you think about trying to power some of these huge rigs, right, very power intensive equipment with diesel's very expensive, much more expensive than grid power, particularly more expensive than grid power when you have renewables that are zero marginal fuel costs, right? So most days power in Texas is 10 or 20 bucks a megawatt hour. That's a penny or two a kilowatt hour. That's very cheap. They would like to be able to get that power. They can't get it because there's not enough transmission to connect their operations. Right. So this whole thing that transmission is like only some subsidy to wind and solar could not be more wrong. Everybody needs transmission. We all need transmission to be able to get electrons to where we live. And the oil and gas industry, of all folks, need more transmission as well. What he said, and there's a report out from was it IHS Market or S&P did this report that basically said right now the demand of oil and gas for that's grid connected is something like 3 or 4 gigawatts. Right. Within 10 years, they expect that to be 3 or 4 times that amount. They basically need a Houston worth of power to power their operations to be connected in the next 10 years.
Right. The Bureau of Economic Geology, the UT Bureau of Economic Geology, has also done an analysis on the power demand in the Permian. And so, yeah, the goal, and it was a little surprising to me that Sheffield talked about it, and it's frankly the way that he did. They want to power their drill rigs, they want to power their frac fleets, and all of their pumping, right? To all of their oil and natural gas compression, get it all grid connected. But they're very constrained on the amount of transmission that's available out there. And I didn't quite understand. A friend of mine is very familiar with Wärtsilä. Why don't they get a bunch of Wärtsiläs out there? They don't need as much transmission. They can do it with smaller distribution lines and so on. But nevertheless, I forgot where we were going with that, but the transmission. So the transmission, I agree. Yeah, there's no doubt there are transmission constraints in West Texas, but there's a lot of, you talked about the amount of solar that's coming on. Wind is, from what I see, is slowing down in Texas. It's slowing down.
That's right.
Across the U.S. Solar is ramping a lot of places, a lot of land use conflicts around that, but nevertheless, not some in Texas as well. But is solar able to ramp, to expand because it doesn't need as much new transmission capacity? Give me your view. We talked about the Permian, but overall in the state, do we need more high voltage transmission? If so, where?
So to answer the first question, solar is more flexible as far as where it can site and sort of getting past some of the transmission bottlenecks. Right. So we are seeing now, and last I heard, this might have been a year ago, so it may be even more now, but somebody had said to me like a year ago, I think there are now, I think this is right. If I'm wrong, I'll email you a correction. You can put it in the show notes, but I'm pretty sure this is right. About half of Texas counties right now have active solar development. So obviously the best solar resource is going to be way out in West Texas. That's true not only because it's a desert and just gets more solar radiation. It's also true, and people don't often think about this, but California has problems with solar and its so-called duck curve, which we don't need to get into. But I think just to think about it this way: if you're in California, you're a grid operator and you're trying to provide power for San Francisco, LA, San Diego, that's west of where your best solar resource is, right? So the sun is setting on your solar resource before it sets on your load centers. That's bad. In Texas, it's the other way around. Think about Houston compared to the Pecos, right? Like the far west Texas, right? So the sun goes down on Houston Much later, it goes down out in West Texas. So one more reason why Texas is better than California, in case you needed another one. So that solar resource in West Texas is where that's most of where the solar is going, but you are seeing more and more solar development in North Texas and East Texas and South Texas, because it's still, while it's not as good a resource as West Texas, it's still a really, really good solar resource. It's still Texas. We still have a lot of sunshine, right? So you're seeing that. As far as where we need the transmission, though, last year the Independent Market Monitor calculated the cost of congestion to the market, and congestion is just basically, right, you have the power, it's being produced, but it can't get to where it needs to go because there's not enough room on the power lines. That cost consumers $3 billion in 2022 alone. So that number will grow if we don't build new transmission. I'm often critical of the Public Utility Commission, so I do like to give credit to the Public Utility Commission where I can. They did approve a new power line down to South Texas, into the Rio Grande Valley. And that was critical because it's a little bit islanded down there. There's not a lot of connections to the rest of the state. And that's a reliability problem for the folks that live there. It's also a reliability problem for the rest of the state because we have a really good wind resource down there. The wind that blows on the coast, it actually produces quite well at 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon and even into the evening hours, as opposed to West Texas wind, where you get more of a lull in the middle of the day. Anybody that's been to the Texas beach on a summer afternoon knows the wind is usually blowing, right? So that transmission is going to help bring that low cost power up. It also helps the folks down there when that wind is still, they're able to bring power in from the rest of the state. But we need a lot more of it, mostly going out to West Texas, to the Permian, like we talked about it, and more down to South Texas.
Gotcha. What about nuclear energy? And this is some discussion I've had with a lot of people about, there's a lot of money that's being put into small modular reactors. Dow has announced that it wants to build SMRs at some of its Gulf Coast facilities using a high temperature gas reactor from X Energy. I'll ask the question as succinctly as I can. Can nuclear power work in a deregulated or restructured market like Texas?
It's a great question. Maybe. I think it can. I think it can work in the model that you just described, where there's a big off-taker like Dow. I mean, you think of the way renewables really started to rise was they had corporate off-takers with good balance sheets and credit ratings and money behind them purchasing the projects, right? I mean, some of those early Walmart PPAs and stuff like that really accelerated the renewable energy industry. Perhaps that could work for nuclear as well. I don't think I'd be.
But if they were going to try and participate in an energy only market, in a market that, I'm going to say it is in Texas has been the thumb is on the scale of renewables in Texas and elsewhere because of all the subsidy, investment tax credit, production tax credit, right? If I was building capacity in Texas or anywhere else, why would I build anything but wind and solar, given that you can get 44 cents out of every dollar of capital you need from the tax credits, right? So how would nuclear be able to compete in a market where you're only able to sell watt hours and you're not getting those kind of tax credits that the other generators are getting?
Well, they do get them now. So nuclear now does get that tax credit, existing and new, right? So the 4 units in Texas are now earning the production tax credit just the same that solar and wind does. So the tax credit under the Inflation Reduction Act was changed to be technology neutral. As long as it's a zero emission source, it earns it. So that goes for gas with carbon capture, that goes for nuclear. They all can earn it now. Yeah, that is in effect. So
okay,
nuclear
well,
now gets that.
I misapprehended that. I didn't realize that the existing nuclear plants could get the production tax credit. So that's
now they couldn't before. And storage too, by the way. Storage was not eligible unless it was co-located with solar, which, it's fine to co-locate it. That's great, but there's no reason why, if you put a solar plant over here and a battery over here, they don't need to be at the same spot. You could still, it's the beauty of the grid, right? You could store the power no matter where it's coming from. But that's the way the tax code used to be. Now storage can get that tax credit as well.
Okay, well, so that's interesting. Now, wait a minute. You're saying battery storage. You're saying CCS. You lost me there. We were talking about carbon capture.
So what I meant about carbon capture, yeah, there is the carbon capture, the
45Q.
45Q, 80, $85, whatever it is. But what I was referring to is there actually was a power plant announced. There's an announcement on this. They're supposed to break ground at some point and be open by 2026. A company called Net Power.
Right.
I believe Occidental is the one that's buying the power, one of the largest producers in the Permian, and they're going to build a 300 megawatt gas plant where the carbon is captured pre-combustion. This is the alum cycle plant.
Right.
They'll be able to earn the production tax credit because they're zero emission.
Gotcha. Because they're going right. So they're capturing the CO2. I just wanted to make sure I was clear. But just to be clear on the nuclear part of this, because as I've looked at Dow's deal, I thought, well, maybe Dow's just going to decide, well, we're going to use all the process heat from the reactor. We're going to use all the electricity ourselves, and maybe not even sell the electricity into the ERCOT market. But let me ask again, if I've heard you correctly, an SMR coming into Texas, how viable is it for them to try and get into the Texas marketplace when they have to compete with wind and solar, given they have regulatory issues, but just the high capital costs that are going to be with nuclear. Just if you look at it from that standpoint, how are you think they will be able to compete in the ERCOT market?
I mean, it just all depends on how far down the price curve they can come, right? I'm a little bearish on nuclear just because the costs are just so high, and the cost of a combination of wind, solar, storage, even the way geothermal's coming down the cost curve, the way these gas carbon capture plants are coming down the cost curve. I kind of hope I'm wrong. I'd like to see some small modular reactors work, and I'm humble enough that I could be wrong. We could talk, and it wouldn't be 5 years, maybe 10 years, and I'll just say, yeah, I was wrong. Those things are great. I just think that the price is going to be too high. But what Dow could do with that is use that power behind the meter, as it were, right? I assume this is what they're probably going to do, and then let those electrons flow into the grid when power prices are really high. This is what Dow does this today with their combined heat and power plants. Dow and a bunch of others. If you look on the ERCOT reports where they write down all our capacity, there's a thing there that says private use networks, puns they're called in the industry, and that they do that. They'll if depending on what they're manufacturing, for some things you just can't turn off, but for other things you can just shut down your manufacturing and let that power flow in and take all that money that's coming from the market. And I think that's a good thing. That's more power in when we need it.
Well, and to be clear, I mean, I'm pro-nuclear, but I agree with you. There are a lot of hurdles that have to be overcome, and Nuclear Regulatory Commission being one of the biggest one, and then the supply chain just in terms of who's going to build it and where, and then you've got the fuel supply issue, which is a whole other complicated set of issues. A quick station break. My guest is Doug Lewin. He's the president of Austin-based consulting firm called Stoic Energy. You can find him at douglewin.substack.com. We've talked about a lot of things in terms of where the market is going, and give me your crystal ball now. We've got a few weeks left in the Texas Legislature. How do you think things are going to shake out? Because as we've talked about, there are many billions of dollars at stake here. Let me ask this question first. What should happen? What if Doug Lewin was in charge? If Doug Lewin was governor? What would you be?
We'd have a lot of other problems if I was governor. Let me tell you.
If you were the governor, and we throw Abbott out, and I install you as governor, what would you do? What would be the first priority? Because the question, of course, all this is being driven largely, I would say, by the Winter Storm Uri, right? The blackouts. We don't want this to happen again. So, what's your ideal scenario for assuring reliability in this market that is? It needs more assurance of reliability.
So I will answer your question as like what I would do if I was in charge. But I will say, I think one of the geniuses of our democratic system and even sort of our political economy and the markets and all of that is that we don't have a system where one person, because I don't know, right? Like I know a couple of things, but I'm not smart enough to know like exactly what should be done. And this is why I think it's so important to have markets with as strong a price signal, competitive, as possible, so that markets can actually make those decisions about where to allocate resources. But But I'll say this, we talked about this earlier, Robert. We started talking about summer and winter and how they're very different. I never really got to winter. I think what we need is to make sure we put focus. I like to put it this way. If you think about football and take a football analogy here, I think what is going on right now is that the PUC and ERCOT, and I don't know how involved with this the governor is, maybe throw him in there with that group. They're trying right now to run like triple reverse flea flicker on the first day of practice. We haven't talked about blocking and tackling yet. And I know they'll say we've been doing weatherization inspections, but we talked earlier about December 22nd and 23rd and how renewables actually helped a lot to on the 22nd and 23rd. On the night of the 23rd, wind dropped, the sun went down, gas powered the system. I'm not here trying to do anything but talk about the facts of the situation. On the night of the 22nd at 9 p.m., there were 6,000 megawatts of thermal plants out. Not let's be even more specific. Gas and coal, because nuclear did not have problems during this one. We lost one of the nuclear units during Uri. The other three stayed up. During this December event, none of the nuclear units went down. 6,000 megawatts of gas and coal. Not an extraordinary number, pretty average number at 9 p.m. 9 a.m., there was 14,000 megawatts of gas and coal offline. Over that bitter cold night, we had a 120% increase in gas and coal outages. We have not properly weatherized our gas and coal power plants. Gas output, gas supply output, from the Permian and from the Eagle Ford, and I guess throw Haynesville in there. I don't know if Haynesville had any problems, but it was down 30%, as reported by Wood Mackenzie. I believe the number is actually 32%. So we have not properly weatherized our gas supply. And demand was off the charts. The ERCOT predicted we would need like 60 gigawatts. We ended up needing 74. It was a 20+% demand forecast miss because we haven't weatherized our homes and buildings. So we're wasting a ton of energy, and you waste a lot more when it's 5 degrees than you waste when it's 50 degrees. And that's because of the problem of resistance heat. We have very inefficient heat. People don't know this, but your unit that sits outside your home is true. Where I live, it shuts off. Its design value is down to 32 degrees. And then you heat your home. Well, this is not true in my home because I actually have gas heat. But if you have electric heat, it operates from 32 degrees. And when you drop below 32 degrees, you start heating your home with a toaster oven with a fan blowing over it. You're heating your home with a hairdryer. It's
Right.
incredibly inefficient, and our demand spikes. So to solve the winter problems, we need to weatherize, gas supply, power plants, homes and buildings. As far as the other stuff about the market and what do we need to do those aren't market design problems, right? That none of that has anything to do with market design. Well, I shouldn't say that. There might be a little overlap there to market design, but mostly it's a problem of regulation. I look at it this way, Robert. It's like, in a capitalist system, in any system, do you want the state like deciding which restaurants you can go to? No, you'd like for the free market to, there's restaurants, some of them do really well and they stay open and some of them don't, they close, somebody else moves in. But you damn well want a health inspector, right? You want to see that A on the window when you walk in, right? Same thing. I want a diversity of energy resources. I want them competing in a market, and I want an inspector there to make sure the damn thing is going to work when it gets down to 0 degrees next time. But as far as the market design, I actually think that the market we have, it's certainly going to need some tweaks and enhancements as we go along. But the PUC made a change 1 year ago where they increased the scarcity pricing to generators. That injected $2 billion into the market in 2022 alone. This is we talked about this earlier, right? The $45 billion system, about half of that is generation. That's a 10% increase going into the wholesale power generation market last year alone. That's a pretty powerful price signal to LCRA, who, by the way, is building new gas plants, right?
So I want to just interrupt here, Doug, because
Sure.
you jumped right ahead of me. So this additional money then that is being incentive that is now the PUC is allowing for. Forgive me for not following what you just but the market has been tweaked to incent more thermal generation or more dispatchable generation. Am I reading that back correctly?
Close. It is called the operating reserve demand curve. This is the scarcity pricing in the system. It is technology neutral. Wind and solar can get it, but it only kicks on when we're really close to, our reserves are being depleted. So something like 80% of that money is going to thermal plants, to gas, coal, and nuclear plants. It's working as it. Yeah.
So do we have new gas plants being built now? I haven't checked the ERCOT.
We do.
And how much capacity is that?
So according to the Independent Market Monitor, and this is in a report that she gives to the PUC and the legislature, I think since 2014, we've added, I think the number is right at about 8,000 megawatts. We've been adding about 1,000 megawatts a year on average. That's held the last 2 years. We've added about 2,000 megawatts. Most of that is a company called Wattbridge that has added some small power plants in the Houston area. But then there's also the LCRA one. And by the way, when we have these discussions, we almost never include those Enchanted Rock units, right? I mean, we sort of discount the distributed stuff that's going in, but we shouldn't do that. That's also generation. And in the interconnection queue, there are 12,000 megawatts in there right now. Not all of that will get built, but some of it will. And if they don't put this PCM into place, we may lose some older plants. I would argue that's good, because when you lose the older plants, you're increasing that price signal for newer plants to come in. And when you're dealing with a winter extreme or a summer extreme, let me ask you this, Robert. You're about to go on a road trip and it's 100 degrees. Do you want to hop in a car built in the 50s or 60s, or do you want to hop in a car built last year?
The latter.
Yeah. Right. So right now we've got a system where we've got 5,000 megawatts that was built in the 60s. We got another 10,000 megawatts that was built in the 70s, and we're cobbling this stuff together with duct tape and baling wire and hoping that we'll get through the summer and the winter. I think we want to retire those older plants and build newer ones. And as long as you have that scarcity pricing signal there, that signal goes up every time somebody retires. So I actually think the market that we have right now is quite well suited to the challenges that we have of integrating variable renewables and making sure we have enough at these times of extreme peaks.
Well, so see if I'm hearing you correctly. Am I right to assume maybe you think that the legislature doesn't need to do anything? In fact, that if they do something, it might be worse than doing nothing. What you've said just implies to me that you think a lot of what this legislation is pending is going to feather bedding for the existing generators, that maybe we don't need to do anything.
Well, the legislation that has moved through the Senate, and I believe was also voted out of House committee, Senate Bill 2012, is being referred to as the PCM guardrail bill. What they're trying to do is put some guardrails on what the PUC wants to do with the PCM, and not let it be, as I have called it, and many others, including the Texas Oil and Gas Association, has called. I agree with them on this. I probably agree with them on a lot of stuff, but they said that this would be a blank check for generators. And so the bill that I do think they need to pass is like, hey, PUC, if you're going to go forward with this thing, you don't get to just hand a blank check to the generators. There's going to be some cost cap and control on what you're doing here.
So we could have a modified capacity market that would have stops on it in terms of what the overall cost would be to consumers, but it would, in theory, would I think it was your piece today or the last few days where you said, yeah, it's not going to come into effect for years. It's going to take years to develop. But if it does get developed and it does happen, then this SB 2012 would at least limit the cost to consumers, or just not be a blank check, to use your the Oil and Gas Associations. Have I gotten that right?
You have.
Okay, good. So we're right at an hour. Again, my guest is Doug Lewin. He's the president of Austin-based Stoic Energy, a consulting firm. DougLewin.substack.com. Two last questions. What are you reading, Doug? You're in front of a big bookshelf of books, shelves of books. What What are the top ones on your list these days?
I'm not reading it now, but I got Robert Bryce's book. This guy Robert Bryce who wrote
Oh,
Cronies. That's a great one. Highly recommend people
that's a
check that
really good
out.
one.
I heard you ask that
the,
question.
the paperback is out May 16th, 3 years
A
after
Question
the
of
hardbacks.
Power.
Yeah, Question of
All
Power.
right, nice. So I just one that I just finished recently was this one, Stolen Focus by Johan Hari. Honestly, it was part of my inspiration for starting the Substack. I am, like many other people, quite addicted to Twitter. I don't think it's a sort of a force for good at this point, and I'm trying to like limit my Twitter use. And that book really put into it's not just about social media. It's a great book. It's about a lot of other things. I haven't actually read this one in a long time, so this is cheating a little bit. I hope you'll forgive me, Robert, but I really like this one. And we've talked about Insel a little bit. This one, The Power Makers by Maury Klein. I don't know if you know any others, Robert. I'm always looking for good histories of the utility industry. There was one written on Insel. I forget what that one was called, but that one's great. Is Merchant of Power, actually, is what it was called. But those are probably the two best books, Merchant of Power and Power Makers, on the history of the utility industry. Those are a couple. I also just, I read last year, I read the fourth of Caro's biographies of LBJ, and I just finished reading The Power Broker about Robert Moses. All the Caro books are fantastic. So
sure.
Good.
Okay. Well, that's a good rundown. And then the last question, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that gives me hope. There's a lot that worries me too. But I think I'm gonna talk about something we only very briefly talked about on this call, but geothermal power gives me hope, Robert, because the thing that I love about, there's a lot I love about geothermal. Number one, it is a renewable zero emission source. Number two, it can actually be flexible. So you don't have to just deploy it like just at a steady stream. You can actually build up that pressure underground and release more of it at the times of peak. So when the sun's shining, we got plenty of solar. We can sort of build up that steam generated by the heat of the earth, and then wait till the sun goes down and release it. So it actually acts as a form of energy storage. And the other thing I like about it is it uses the skill set of the oil and gas industry. I don't think the oil and gas industry is going any. I try to be a realist and a pragmatist. I don't think it's going anywhere for quite a long time, but I do think there will be a decline over time. And geothermal it's drilling, and it's horizontal drilling, and it's even there's even like some amount of splitting rocks to be able to get into different reservoirs and stuff. So I love that a renewable resource can use the skill set of our oil and gas workers that our state is relied on to build wealth for generations.
Well, that's good. Well, we'll stop there. My guest again has been Doug Lewin, the president of Austin-based Stoic Energy. DougLewin.substack.com is where you can find him. Doug, thanks for coming on the Power Hungry podcast. Great to catch up, and great rundown of all the things that are happening at the legislature. So thanks again for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And to all of you in podcast land, make sure and give me, if you're going to give me a rating on those podcast things, 5, 6, 12 stars. Follow me on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. And until the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast, see ya.